Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another interview. Maryland State Bar Association partnering with Stevenson University to interview all of the gubernatorial candidates, all those who are seeking to become the next governor of this great state of Maryland. And this afternoon we have Ashwani Jain, a first-time candidate and program director for the National Kidney Foundation in the DMV area, and very honored to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, no, thank you so much for this opportunity. It means a lot.
Great. Well, we're going to get to it. We've got an hour to go through lots of issues and your positions so that the bar members and folks across the state really get to know you and what you want to do if you become the next governor of the state of Maryland. So let me just ask you an open-ended question, just for those who may not know you yet. Tell us about yourself and how is it that you came to be sitting here running for governor of Maryland?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you so much for providing this platform and opportunity just to know all the candidates. So as a starting point, my name is Ashwani Jain. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a 32-year-old cancer survivor who's also a son of immigrants. I'm a product of Maryland public schools. I've been able to work in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And I also had the opportunity to serve in the Obama White House and in 2 federal agencies. And at the end of the day, I'm running for governor to make our politics genuinely more inclusive and accessible. And this idea of inclusion started back when I was 13 years old in the middle of 8th grade and diagnosed with cancer. And during that time, I really saw a world in which I may not get to leave the 4 walls of that hospital room. I saw kids sitting right next to me lose their battles. I felt really depressed and alone. And I found many who were making decisions for me as opposed to making them with me. And so it was in that moment I thought if I was blessed enough to get a second chance at life, I was going to try to make it count. And luckily, I not only beat cancer, but I was able to go from survivor to advocate. And ironically, by getting involved in politics, I actually found opportunities to really connect with others who had similar struggles and channel my pain and depression into something positive. And it's that advocacy work that has now led me to run for governor. And while I would be the nation's youngest governor, I have the experience and perspective needed to really serve Marylanders well. Like I said, I've worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. I helped manage the political appointee process in the Obama White House and administration. I worked to get over 400,000 Marylanders access to affordable health care when I was at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I've worked on affordable housing issues when I was at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I also helped get the NIH and the FDA, both housed in Maryland, billions in additional funding when I was then Vice President Biden's Director of Outreach for what was called the Cancer Moonshot. And equally important, and this is the perspective that I would bring, as someone who was born and raised in Maryland, product of Maryland public schools, a child of immigrants and minority-owned small business owners, and as a cancer survivor, I know what it feels like to be written off or have other people make decisions for me instead of with me. And that's also really important because I'm not waiting until the election to be inclusive. I already have built one of the largest grassroots campaigns in the entire state of Maryland. I'm the first statewide candidate in the nation to be 100% volunteer run and limit the influence of money by making all my events free. Instead of spending time on making donor calls, I am actually in a different county every single day connecting one-on-one with voters through what I'm calling my mobile campaign offices. And then since January, I've shared over 150 detailed policies on my website, every one of which were created by residents who are going to be impacted by those policies. And one of my signature programs is called the Maryland Now Plan, which will eliminate the state income tax for 95% of Marylanders, make Maryland the first state to make public transit free, create the nation's very first guaranteed jobs program, legalize marijuana while expunging records, and then also impose very specific anti-corruption measures. And at the end of the day, I'm doing all this because I really think decisions about us should not be made without us.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to get into all of those topics. So you kind of answered my second question, which is what are your top priorities in terms of if in a Jain administration? So let's get into some specific issues then. I want to start, if you look at polls, not that you should necessarily, but don't necessarily, they're not always right, but COVID and public safety are 2 of the top issues registering all across the state of Maryland. So I'm going to start with COVID. And as we talked beforehand, obviously we both had family members who have passed because of it. I want to talk about the policy related to it. First of all, obviously the governor has gotten very high marks nationally as well as in the state. on that issue, being a responsible leader on the issue. It's challenging and something brand new for all. I guess I'll ask you this: what would you do differently? And more importantly, because we're looking to the future, what is it that with, this thing is not going away with the variants?
Yeah.
So what is it that we do moving forward?
Yeah, I think for one, I do think we were too quick to reopen. Our current governor opened up schools and businesses even before a majority of our residents were fully vaccinated with both doses as per the CDC guidelines. But more importantly, I think this is an issue of equity. Especially in the beginning, it was really difficult for folks to schedule an appointment to get a vaccine. I don't think we invested enough in mobile education units, especially in low-income neighborhoods, communities of color, to educate them on the importance of getting vaccinated. I don't think we had enough resources to small businesses to keep them afloat, to provide them the tax incentives, to still pay their employees, give them the protective equipment that they needed. And while we needed to do virtual learning, we didn't invest in rural broadband, for example. So we're asking educators and students to learn online because we needed to keep them safe, but we also didn't give them the resources or funding to do that. And so moving forward, I would obviously account for those things in the future in case there's any other issues that could come up. I would also make sure that we're doing a full audit of all of our hospitals and figure out exactly what do they need so that in the future, if these things happen, we're more prepared.
And it's your position that we don't do that right now?
We're starting to do that now, but in the very beginning, at least for the first couple months, I don't think we did a quick enough or good enough job of really making sure we have more equity in the vaccine rollout and making sure that we're ensuring that those who need a vaccine or are eligible to get a vaccine were knowledgeable and had the access to do that.
So let me push back a little bit.
Sure.
Maryland was out front on all of these issues, and I guess I would ask you, which state did it better than us?
I mean, it's one of those things where if you look at even currently, right, the fact that Garrett County, for example, or some of these rural counties in the state of Maryland still have a really large population that are not vaccinated.
Well, is that because of state government's failure, or is that because people are refusing to get vaccinated? Because my understanding, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you can get a vaccine on demand in Maryland, and we are, my understanding at least, is that we're leading the country in terms of our vaccination rates. Right. So I understand that you can point problems and you can point issues, but what is it that the state government has done wrong on that front? I don't recall hearing that there was any lack of access.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's one of those things where, right, because I am running for governor, I don't want to just give the normal talking points. I want to give solutions and things that I would have done if I was governor and what I would do if elected, which I think that's what residents really want to know. So yes, we overall did a pretty good job and definitely much better than a lot of the country. But where I see those inequities is when I'm talking to residents and voters, senior residents, folks who live in some of these rural communities especially, or in communities of color, where there's not enough, and there was not enough emphasis on education of why it's important to get a vaccine, that this is not the government trying to repeat the Tuskegee experiments, for example, in the past. This is a proven vaccine that's been tested. And when you try to schedule an appointment in the beginning to get a vaccine, there were a lot of residents who had difficulty accessing and making that appointment. So again, we're at a place now where we're obviously much better than the rest of the nation, but we should have done a little bit better in terms of setting those protocols in place. And in the future, again, making sure we have those systems in place for another variant or whoever knows if there's another issue that could come up.
So let me just put a little bit of a finer point on it. Yeah. I guess I am questioning, because I know of some of the efforts that were being undertaken to go out into communities, mobile units and things of that nature. I guess as a more general question, like, who did it better than Maryland? What state did better than us?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at states like New York or California, I mean, obviously they have a much bigger population and obviously they were hit hardest, but then when they put out, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, when they were making sure that they really did, I think, earlier jobs of educating folks in low-income communities, in diverse communities, I think that's why they were able to, I think, maybe recover a little quicker than maybe we were able to recover.
Okay. So you mentioned vaccine mandates. Are you for vaccine mandates?
Yes, I mean, this is something that I would follow the CDC guidelines, and if people are not getting vaccinated, and when their individual choices affect public safety, then we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that they're taking the precautions they need. So if that means vaccines, yes. And if people are not getting vaccines in the meantime, we do need to require masks as well.
So should the state of Maryland in a Jain administration, sorry, I have to keep going back and forth. Do we, assuming that you were elected governor, would you propose having a vaccine mandate, meaning every resident that is eligible for a vaccine would be required to get one?
Yes, because that's what the science tells us, that in order to make sure that more people are not dying, being put at risk, and that we're not closing up our economy back and forth again, you need to make sure that everyone who's eligible and able to take one is taking the vaccine. And when people don't do that and they're putting others at risk, I think it is the job of government to step in and require it. We already require it in schools, for example, with measles, and that's how we got rid of polio and smallpox. And there are things and regulations put in place that are similar to this, even if you look at seatbelts, for example, or anything where an individual freedom and choice you can have, but when it comes to public safety, if you're not taking the necessary actions needed, I do think you need to have regulations or mandates, in this case, in place.
How would you, I guess, would you say that, for example, you can't get on public transportation unless you're vaccinated, or you can't go into state buildings, or you can't travel from, how is it, I guess, specifically? It's an interesting debate that's raging across the country, and you've gone further than other candidates have on this issue. How do you get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, it's all the above, right? And one of the examples, even though it's a little different, one of the examples that I give is, if you look at restaurants and bars, right? Even to order an alcoholic beverage, they do require a proof of your age, right? They require some sort of identification that you can provide to get into a bar, to order alcohol, to order drinks. And I know this is a different example, but when I'm speaking with residents and voters who might be on the fence, when I try to practicalize this issue, practicalize, that might be a real word.
Not sure it's there. But
when I try to make it relatable to some of the other aspects of their lives, we have actually found that more people are able to get on board with it. And so yes, it would require them that if you want to go to any public buildings, if you want to get on public transit, for example, yes, and if you want to travel, you need to show proof of vaccination. And again, this is not, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, not at all.
This is, I want to be clear, this is not something that I'm stating as my opinion, right? When the science tells us, and we've been through this now for so long, and we have these new variants popping up, when the science tells us that you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to be safe, and if people are not doing it, I do think the government's job is to step in, provide those smart regulations or mandates until the issue is resolved, and then you can remove those mandates in place. But it's only going to hurt us if we're not being proactive.
How about things, somebody suggested that we, in doing a mandate, because you hear about businesses being responsible for it, that the government wants, and state employees. How about something like getting your driver's license or acquiring public housing, for example, housing vouchers and Medicaid or public assistance? Requirement vaccinated before you get those government services?
Yes, but again, you have to look at it in a comprehensive way. We also have to provide them the opportunities and the resources to get vaccinated, right?
Sure.
So if the options are there, if we're providing those resources, then I do believe, yes, you need to be vaccinated and at least provided opportunities to get vaccinated. So if somebody either had a distrust of the system or just was physically unable to get to a vaccination site or anything else, if they're eligible, then we can provide those services, but the mandate still needs to be there. And again, if we don't, we're putting other people, including those individuals, at greater risk.
And until such time as everybody's vaccinated, or even after they're vaccinated, mandated masks in school?
I mean, we need to. Because again, if we don't, we're only going to put more people at risk. We're going to end up, hopefully not, but we're going to end up closing schools again, closing businesses again. It's going to hurt our economy. If majority of the residents are not vaccinated, and that means educators, students alike, then yes, we need to require masks to put in place.
Okay. All right. Very specific answers. Let's move on to the second issue, which is, and this is obviously quite comprehensive, but the issue of public safety. So I'm going to just open it up to you and say, what does the Jain administration prioritize? What are the types of things that you'd like to see the legislature do? Things that have gone well, things that you think haven't gone as well in the issue of public safety?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always have my notebook ready because I don't like to just give empty rhetoric. I don't like to give just talking points. I like to go through those details. And since January, I have shared an entire comprehensive criminal justice platform on my website so people can hold me accountable. But I think a lot of it starts with this idea of demanding accountability. When you demand accountability, it doesn't negate the good work that law enforcement does, but it ensures, just like we do in any other field, that if you're not doing your job right, or if you have a job that can lead to the murder of individual residents and break this idea of community trust, you need to put specific measures in place. And all the things I'm going to talk about right now were created by residents from law enforcement community and by residents alike who are part of our volunteer operation. So I talk about everything from ending extreme sentences for children, ending the money bail system, and I can go into deeper, but just to kind of give you an overview first. I talk about making sure we no longer, and I know we already ended it, but no longer having for-profit prison contracts in the future, making sure we treat drug and opioid use as a mental health and public health issue, not as a crime. I talk about legalizing marijuana and expunging records, obviously. I talk about preparing those in prison for life outside of prison. I talk about investing in more mental health professionals, so we get to the root of some of the causes that allow people to kind of keep going back and forth through the jail system. And I also talk about making sure that we have more disposable income for folks and better access to jobs and a reduced cost of living. So I think if we look at all those in that kind of a comprehensive way, we can not only reform our criminal justice system, but make our towns and our cities more safe in the long term as well.
Okay, so just a few years ago, in a bipartisan fashion, the General Assembly passed the Justice Reinvestment Act, the single largest criminal justice reform in the country, certainly in the state of Maryland. What is it that was left out specifically of that? Because a lot of the things you just mentioned, for example, public health, I mean, not mental health, I'm sorry, drug treatment. So let me just start there. So the Justice Reinvestment Act was very specific on the issue of drug treatment. So what is it that that was left out of the 8507, 8509, sections of the Justice Reinvestment Act?
Yeah, I think it is enforcing those policies in a more equitable way, and it's looking at all the other issues at the same time. So when it comes to drug treatment, for example, we have to, at least from a budgetary standpoint, invest in those rehab centers and nonprofits, especially in rural communities where they don't always have that access, and making sure that we have dedicated funding for those nonprofits, making sure that we're not going to send you to prison if you get caught with drugs, or if you have an opioid abuse issue, but really making sure that we're connecting those dots. So a lot of good was done, and we definitely set a lot of great frameworks and foundations in place. But I think the enforcement of the budget, the enforcement of connecting those dots, and also connecting it to the other issues I mentioned, I think that is something we can do better at.
So what is it, how much more should we be, I mean, without getting back into it, because one of the things that was done is, as you may know, in justice reinvestment was there was a big lag time for individuals who are getting out of jail to go into treatment facilities. Now there's a mandate, so it's not a matter, like there's no, it's not an enforcement issue, at least on that front, from individuals who are in jail and a judge determines that they are eligible to get out. So the money is there at least for those populations. So what is it that we're talking, who is it that you're talking about that aren't getting resources?
Yeah, before they enter the jail system itself. So I think that's the starting point. So not just taking care of those who are leaving the prison system.
Well, this isn't just leaving them, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but the 8507 program is for at any stage in the criminal justice system. It doesn't have to be just somebody leaving jail. It can be from the onset, it can be in lieu of incarceration, it can be after incarceration for a few days, it can be after for a few years. So who is it that's not getting the resources right now that you think are, I'm trying to pinpoint what we're talking about.
Yeah, so what we have found when we're talking to residents and community leaders is, especially folks in low-income neighborhoods and folks in rural communities who are going through this process, they're not able to get access to that rehab center because there may not be a rehab center, or they had some sort of clinic that was closed within their towns, and then they're not able to get physically to another center. And there's still this idea of making sure that they understand what rules are in place. They, as residents, they know that there are services in place, it's more accessible, and it's more inclusive of them. So again, like I said, the foundation was definitely there, and the bill did a great job. But I think the enforcement of it, in terms of making sure residents are aware of those services, and making sure from a budgetary standpoint, we're investing more in those rehab centers and nonprofits who deal with this issue in rural communities, in low-income neighborhoods. I feel it's not been fully funded or fully equitable.
All right, so you also mentioned expungement, which, so what is it, who is it in Maryland right now? I saw that on your website as well, and you spoke about it in terms of marijuana. And just for full disclosure, I was the lead sponsor of the decriminalization bill. Who is it that's not able to get expunged right now under Maryland's law? Because that was a big policy thing that you put up there. Who is it that can't get expungement right now?
Well, I think the main thing is because we have still not legalized recreational marijuana. I just want to make it a point and be very mindful of, if we're going to legalize marijuana, we cannot forget about the other part of it, which is if you were ever imprisoned or criminalized because of possession or because of use, that will not appear on your records anymore.
Right. So, but that's already the law.
So it might be in place right now, but when we're fully legalizing marijuana, which we have not done in the state, we've legalized medical marijuana, obviously, for medical use, but when you're fully legalizing it and making sure that you can start growing it, making sure we can have more economic revenue generating from it, I just want to be very mindful and very specific from the onset that when we fully legalize this, we should not forget about that expungement piece of it.
I don't mean to move off of that, but just in terms of expungement, which is an incredibly important issue, a crime that is no longer a crime is expungible, so that when it was decriminalized, anybody with a possession charge for under a certain amount of marijuana can already get it, and then possession itself is already an expungible offense after conviction. So I guess the next question would be, if you were a kingpin selling marijuana and other things, right? Because it's not like you go in, you're not a marijuana kingpin, that's not how it's charged. Would you then permit individuals who were, significant sellers of drugs to be able to expunge their records also? Because again, nobody's like a marijuana kingpin versus it's just a drug kingpin. So would you allow an expansion of expungement on the drug issue to include kingpins and big sellers and distributors and so forth who are doing other things like heroin and crack and things of that nature?
Main focus is personal use. So, and that's where we would rely on our law enforcement officers to really make that distinction of, were you doing this with intent to sell, or were you doing it for personal use? And so I want to make sure that, if you were in as a kingpin or something like that, really trying to sell these things, I think there are nuances that would make it hard to expunge those records because you did commit a much bigger crime. But again, then invest in making sure they go to rehab centers and they're actually, we're actually addressing kind of the root causes of how do we make sure this is not happening again and again, and that those individuals are also able to re-enter society in a more productive manner.
Got it. Just not to put a too fine a point on it, but I just want to try to narrow down who we're talking about, because you are very specific in what you talk about in terms of expungement. Maryland, as of about 4 or 5 years ago, now expunges about, as you know, about 100 crimes that were that were not expungible at that point in time. So and that includes all possession. So anybody who has a criminal record for possession, simple possession, can already expunge. So the question is, what crimes are we like the expansion of expungement that you talk about on your website? I'm just trying to figure out what we're talking about, because the nonviolent crimes seem to already be expungible. So who is it that we're talking about expanding this to?
I mean, what we're finding a lot of the times is people are still not able to get jobs or kind of live their life in society because it's still on a record, or they have to pay a fee, they have to go to court. It is something that's more proactive on their end when we're seeing that in residents. And so I would just make sure that, again, if we're fully legalizing marijuana, which is not already being done in the state, that we just ensure that no one has it still on their records. That's kind of the ultimate goal.
Okay, got it. All right. And then in terms of, you talk about, there's another issue that you spoke about, and I spoke about this with some of the other candidates, and I think it's a different answer than the one you gave. And let me just set it up like this. It's the issue of a school resource officer program. Baltimore County, where you are right now, has a national model for school resource officers. And in fact, one of our school resource officers here in the state, in Baltimore County, was named the National School Resource Officer of the Year. Their focus is on things like coaching and teaching classes, as well as being there, obviously, just in case there's a horrific incident. You call for the complete elimination of the school resource officer program, where in Baltimore County, at least, this is something that is widely popular with communities all across the county. It's been polled, and there is not a single pocket where it's an unpopular issue. School resource officers are, I remember from my time in office, everybody wanted to have one there, and not just for security, but for the community aspect. If you're talking about community relationships and officers and communities working together, why is it that in a place like Baltimore County, where it seems like it's working so well for that very purpose, would you want to eliminate that program?
Yeah, so as a starting point, like I mentioned, every policy, even the proposal that we have on the campaign of entirely removing the SRO program from all of our public schools, it came directly from students, from teachers and educators and parents alike who are on the team already and helping make all these policy decisions and recommendations. So as a starting point, it's not just something I worked with a political consultant for or just made the decision on my own. It was raised to my attention from community members, specifically low-income communities and people of color who do not feel safe when they go into their schools. They feel like it's a prison, and they feel like if they are getting in trouble, they're going to be sent to jail. And what we found is
can I ask you a question about that? Let me ask you a question about that. And I don't mean to push back a little bit, but I do want to, it's a really specific proposal, and believe me, I enjoy the fact that I think it's really good how specific you are with these things. But when you say that, when you say that there are all these individuals that are going to jail and the school to prison pipeline and some of these other things that people use as phrases, can you name one instance in Baltimore County, and I don't mean to stick with Baltimore County, but that is where we are right now. Name one instance in Baltimore County where you think that was done and it was done in an unfair way.
So I can't give you a specific right now. I can follow up if that's okay. But when we look at the statistics, even nationally, of SROs in our public schools, what we have found is 80% of the students who are actually arrested or dealt with in that manner are Black and Latino students. And we have found statistically that they have not actually proven to reduce the instances of violence or crime. And so all we're doing is instead is making students, especially students of color, feel like they're not able to go to school in a safe manner, in their opinion. And also, we should be instead investing in more guidance counselors, social workers. So we're getting, again, to the root of the issue that would cause an issue like that in the first place. Now, at the same time, I do talk about investing in our school security, which are not law enforcement officers, and make sure they have better training to deal with youth specifically, which I know a lot of times they're not necessarily trained specifically for that school or for those particular students. And so in that way, we're looking at it again in totality.
Okay. So in a jurisdiction like Baltimore County, where if a school, wherever it is, wants to have a school resource officer program, a Jain administration would say, absolutely not, you can't have one.
Essentially, yes. Okay. And instead, I would use our public dollars to make sure that they have more guidance counselors and better training for actual school security that are not law enforcement officers.
So you would prefer to have security officers that are what, like, I don't understand, like a private security
So I know a lot of schools right now already have security staff that are faculty members. They already are invested in that specific school. They're from that town. They're from that area. They know the students. And so we can invest in them. But again, the goal should be more on mental health professionals, guidance counselors, social workers.
Okay. Another thing, let's talk about legalization of marijuana. I know you talk about that widely. We've already talked about expungement, and I do want to, I think, actually get back to that for a second. But let's just talk about, you think that we should legalize marijuana in the state?
Yes.
And do you think that they should do it by referendum like they're talking about, or do you think they should just do it?
I think we should just do it.
Okay.
And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it can generate hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue for our state. So it's a way to actually generate revenue. But then also, it is, marijuana is not proven to be as dangerous as alcohol or cigarettes.
How much did you say that you think it can be generated? What was the number you said? Hundreds of millions?
Hundreds of millions, yeah. I mean, if you look at Colorado, they generate, I think, $200-300 million from after they legalize marijuana. So it is a way to generate a lot of revenue in that capacity, and it can reduce a lot of the racial injustices that we have seen, where white and black Americans, use marijuana at similar rates, but black Americans are being criminalized for it more and for harsher sentences.
Let me ask you a question about that.
Yeah.
I saw that on the website as well. It's your contention that people are still being arrested for possession of marijuana here in Maryland?
Yes,
because it's a civil offense.
Right, and
right?
so
it's not a crime.
Right, but they're still being charged, right? And we're not allowing we're not allowing, for example, our agricultural farmers to actually start growing them. We're not allowing us to tax marijuana. We're not allowing it to kind of remove any of those restrictions if you want to use it recreationally.
I do want to make sure, because I think it's important, just to be fair, to actually, I want to get back to before we move on to the details of the legalization. In Maryland, not in other states, not in Alabama, but in Maryland, it's decriminalized. And so if you are caught with possession, whatever community you come from, you cannot be arrested or charged. You can get a civil citation. So who is it that's being arrested? Because I saw you talk about that, and that is definitely a national talking point. But who is it in Maryland that you think is being arrested for possession, and in what jurisdictions is that happening, since it's actually a civil citation?
Yeah, so I want to remove the citation. So they're not being charged in any way. They're not getting cited for it as well. And again, we can I can circle back with you, but we have instances where people are still being charged for possession of marijuana, and they're also, and again, this is the other part of it, we're not able to reap the economic benefits of it as well.
So in terms of people being charged, they would have to have over a certain amount, and then there's getting on to possession with intent to distribute and distribution. Do you think that if we legalize marijuana and it becomes something that is sellable, right? Licenses and so forth. If somebody is on the street still selling marijuana, should that be a criminal offense, or should that be completely decriminalized? Because if you decriminalize it, then why wouldn't they do it, right? Should you keep the illegal black market still criminal?
I mean, yes, right? So once we commercialize it, once we tax it, we can assist those people to actually work in one of the systems that we put in place. But yeah, right, if we're going to commercialize it, then obviously it will, reduce the need for the black market, but also we got to prevent black market sales as well, because, right, just like with anything else, it's not helping us, and it's not actually streamlining that process.
So we would still be arresting people for possession with intent to distribute, distribution, right?
So it wouldn't be, and I'm sorry if I misspoke, I wouldn't criminalize it, but I would just do the same thing where if you don't have a business license, for example, right, you're not going to necessarily be arrested, but there's going to be a fine placed on you. We're going to kind of make sure that we're going to put you in a system to make sure that you actually are not continuing to do those actions.
And so in states that have legalized cannabis programs, they've had trouble with the black market, right, because of pricing and so forth. So at least they have found that the criminalization of the illegal sales has at least helped to some extent.
Okay, well, I'll look into that then.
Okay,
yeah.
I was wondering. Yeah, these are very complicated details.
Yeah.
And with the money that is generated, well, let me take a step back. We have in Maryland a program. It took a while to get there, but a legal medical cannabis program, and a thriving industry within that has, it took 20 years to get there, but nonetheless, how is it that if you think it's important to protect that industry that has kind of put their capital up to do the pioneering of this, versus giving licenses to other individuals? Like, what is a legal marijuana industry look like in a Jain administration?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see those as two separate things, right? One is medically focused, where you need to go to your physician, go to your doctor. And then the other one is for recreational use. And so I do see those as kind of separate entities. But yes, obviously working with what's already been established, bringing those people into the conversation to figure out, hey, does your current business, are you able to expand to recreational use as well? Is there a system that you can still kind of make that distinction? And then also, I think a big part of that is making sure that our farmers have access to that revenue stream as well, and make sure that you increase hemp cultivation. And one way to do that is by making sure we have tax credits for our farmers so they can invest in the new machines needed to actually cultivate hemp. And those can run upwards of $200,000, $300,000 from my understanding. So making sure that we're expanding opportunity zones to include those farmers so that they, as small business owners themselves, also get access to that new revenue stream.
Okay. And you talked about police reform as well.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you led with that one when I said public safety. I want to talk about some public safety, some kind of criminal issues, but criminal law issues. But I do want to ask you about police reform. The General Assembly last year, chaired by my former vice chair, Will Smith, and Vanessa Atterbury and others, did a pretty robust police reform package last year, hailed as, and without going into too many details, but we will go into some, hailed as the nation's kind of biggest one. What do you think they didn't do well?
Yeah. No, I think they did a great job. I think it was a great effort, and it was something that was, years in the making, and a lot of people, especially in the General Assembly, did a lot of hard work getting to that point. People like you and others who have kind of led the foundation, made sure that the system as a whole is in a much better place now than it was before. But the fact that we still have the highest incarceration rate of black men ages 18 to 24 in the nation, I think that shows that there's still a problem. The fact that we still have...
Wait, you think that shows a problem with the police force? You think that that's a police problem?
No, I think it's a lack of accountability and a lack of really looking at all of these issues in a sincere, comprehensive way. And I know we may disagree on this issue, but the fact that, for example, we still have SROs in our schools, the fact that people in especially low income and rural communities don't get the full access to rehab centers or nonprofits to help them with their mental health or any of their drug issues that they might be going through.
How many people, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. I just want to see what the answers are.
Of course.
The school resource officer program, how many people are sitting in jails right now due to the school resource officer program? You said that over incarceration, and the first thing you mentioned was the SRO program. So how many people are actually sitting there in jail right now due to the SRO program?
So when I said the highest incarceration rate, that's the totality. That's looking at our entire prison population per capita compared to other states. And I think Mississippi might be number 2. And when I said the SROs, that was just one part of the multiple parts of my criminal justice platform. And I think
you're not suggesting that there's a significant number of people sitting in jail due to the SRO program, right?
No.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is, if we're not fully looking at the issues in a comprehensive way, addressing some of the
differently
fears,
than the Justice Reinvestment Act.
in addition to, it's looking at that and then adding in more context, more enforcement, and more budgetary equity. I think those are some of the things that we can build upon, but it's not in opposition to what's already been passed.
Okay. Okay. All right, we've talked a lot about criminal justice, but I do have one more. The governor has introduced legislation which doesn't look like it's going to get a vote in the special session, but will be reintroduced during the regular session. I just want to ask you about a couple pieces of it and see if you're for it, against it, and why. He has a bill related to judicial transparency. So some high-profile cases of individuals maybe getting some plea deals. It's complicated. It's not just about what courtroom you're in. A lot goes into that. But the governor wants to shine more of a light on what's going on and who's getting what, particularly when it comes to violent offenses and repeat violent offenses. Yeah. For that proposal, against that proposal, and why?
Yeah, overall, I think we do need more transparency in the system. I think we do need to hold, for example, judges more accountable, and if they're making decisions that are going to impact people's lives, I think they should be able to, the public should be able to access that information, and those judges and individuals should be able to defend themselves and defend those positions. So overall, I do think it's a good step, but it is one of those things where I want to dive a little deeper, and I won't be able to kind of give you that answer fully right now. But again, overall, the more transparency we have, I think it does lead to more accountability, and especially for those people who are in positions of power, who are making decisions on people's livelihoods, I think they need to be held accountable, and they should be able to defend whatever their decisions are.
Okay. The other part of his proposal has to do with sentencing. I mean, there's a lot to it, but one of the bigger proposals that he's put in is for repeat convictions of individuals who have been caught with illegal possession of a firearm in the commission of violent crimes, to increase the sentencing for those individuals. For that proposal, against that proposal, and why?
I mean, I think the fact that we're asking that question shows that there is a discrepancy in our system, right? The whole point of the criminal justice system, in my opinion, is to reform folks. And if we keep having repeat offenders, that means we're not actually addressing the real issues that are happening. And that's where I go back into investing in local communities, making sure that we have better access to preventative attention, making sure we have nonprofits, rehab centers, those types of issues, to really get to, again, the root cause, so that we don't keep having the same people go back and forth.
Sure. So, and that's a pivot. Let me get back to the bill, though. And although I do understand that, and there's kind of the holistic conversation which you've discussed, but there are, in my city, 300 plus murders and well over 1,000 non-fatal shootings, right? And I'm not picking on Baltimore because I adore the city of Baltimore. It's going on in a lot of places. And talking about those things as a holistic approach is good for the long term, you would agree, as you've said. But what do we do right now, and getting back to the specific question, for or against the governor's very specific piece of legislation which would increase the sentence times for repeat violent offenders who have used an illegal gun in the commission of a crime of violence?
I support that, but again, it needs to be more. We need to get to the root cause. So short answer is yes, I do support that. If you're a repeat offender for a violent crime, yes, we need to make sure that we're stopping you to do that. Sometimes that means harsher sentences. But again, if we're not getting to the root cause of the issue, which we still have not gotten to after all these decades of still talking about this issue, I think that's when we're going to not see anything really move forward in a sustainable way.
Got it. For or against mandatory minimum sentences?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. Short answer, against. A little bit more depth into that. Again, the goal should not be just to keep people in prison, just to increase their time in prison, to make sure more people are in prison. The goal should be to really reform folks, make sure they're getting the access to jobs, rehab, whatever else they need, more disposable income, so that they stop committing those crimes and that they are more productive members of our society. And that will also help our overall economy. It will make our community safer. So it's looking at it again through the
not
next
a
step
huge
as well.
philosophical bent against mandatory minimums, or some people have come in and said against all mandatory minimum sentences. Some are for them.
I am very against them, just because, again, I think it goes back to this idea of you are really not trying to address the real underlying issues.
So let me ask you this then. Somebody brought up the issue. So with a mandatory minimum sentence, the one that was the most high profile in Maryland was Jessica's Law, which is the 25-year mandatory minimum for the rape of a first degree rape of a child under the age of 12. Do you make an exception for something like that, or does that get wrapped in with the anti-mandatory minimum as well?
I mean, right. So those are things where I would make some exceptions for those kind of situations, because they obviously, when you commit horrific acts, you need to be held accountable. At the same time, I think those individuals should still be mandated to take other measures to try to rehabilitate themselves.
And how about, like, you had talked about juvenile and wanting to do away with long sentences for juveniles.
Yeah.
Some of those juveniles have committed offenses like the one I just mentioned, unfortunately, where you have, so just as a hypothetical, I mean, do you think that juveniles should not be allowed to get life?
Overall, yes. Now, obviously, to any piece of legislation we're talking about, any policy proposal, there are always going to be exceptions. But when you're looking at what a governor would do, what a legislator would do, or anything else, you have to look at what is the system in place and what are some big improvements that can be made to address some of the discrepancies. And what we're finding is a lot of individuals, a lot of students are put for life, or put for really harsh sentences when they're young, and again, we're not even giving them opportunities to reform themselves.
That's my question, I guess. So if a juvenile I mean, the only offenses you can get life for are rape and murder. So if a juvenile commits a first-degree murder, a premeditated, horrific murder of I'm just giving the worst, example possible, because that's unfortunately what we need to talk about. Some 17-year-old rapes and murders an 8-year-old child. Don't you think in an example like that that's somebody who we should consider giving life without the possibility of parole to?
No, because there needs to be some concerted effort, especially when you're under the age of 18, to rehabilitate. There have been many instances where people do something really horrific when they're younger, and then they end up giving back to society. They end up making amends, even though it's really tough to do that. And that's also why I'm opposed to the death penalty, for example, right? I think there's always a chance for reform, and we always need to make it a possibility so that we're not just having these blanket sentences, no matter how horrific the crime. We really need to try to reform the individuals. And in my opinion, I think that's the entire purpose of the criminal justice system.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes left. We've talked a lot. It's been interesting and detailed discussion. I'm going to try to get through some rapid round questions. And
if you say rapid in front of a politician, I don't know if that's going to work.
Try to get off of public safety for a little bit. The governor put in, and I've asked all the candidates this question, a bill based on a bill by Senator Kramer from Montgomery County, out your way, an executive order in place that said, and it's held to this day, that says that any company associated with this BDS movement, this like Ben and Jerry's or whatever, cannot do business. It's followed a bunch of different states that have done it. Cannot do business with the state of Maryland. Cannot participate in state contracts and cannot be a part of our 401k and pension systems and so forth. Will you commit to keeping that executive order in place?
Short answer, yes. Longer answer is I think that's where it really needs to depend upon individual cases to figure out, what exactly are they doing that is, really detrimental or really against the values that we have as Americans, as Marylanders, making sure that they're not anti-Semitic, making sure that they don't discriminate against folks in the LGBTQ community. It's using the power of the government to make sure that no businesses are discriminating against anybody else or any other entity. And if they are, then yes, we need to remove those contracts. We need to make sure that we are putting some smart enforcements in place.
So you want to expand what the governor's executive order does and use that power more widely?
I don't know if expanding is the right word. It was just more of being mindful of, which is what this order would do, right? Just being very mindful of who are we.
This order is very specific. It says if you have to sign an affidavit apparently that says I am not involved in this, and you can be
and I agree to that. But the purpose behind it, right? The reason why it was brought up in the first place and the precedents that it would set is again going back to this idea of what are the companies that we allow to operate in our state, and are they discriminating against residents in an unfair way?
Okay. And then some other questions, just some rapid round questions. Interesting, of interest to the bar would be judicial elections. You think that judges in Maryland, some judges are appointed, some levels of judge are appointed, and some level are appointed/elected. Should Maryland abolish the judicial election system and just go to straight appointments?
Short answer, no. Longer answer, I do believe that if judges, or again, anyone who's in a position of power, who's going to be making a decision that will impact the lives of their community members or of an individual, they should be held accountable. They should be able to defend those decisions as well. We need to make sure they're nonpartisan elections, but I think elections are really important for that reason. Because again, it demands you to go back to the community that you are serving, that you are representing, and make the case of why these decisions were good, make sure community members have a say in who's actually representing them in all these different capacities.
So so right now Maryland has district court judges that are appointed, circuit court that are appointed and then have to stand for election, Court of Appeals and Court of Special Appeals that are appointed. you're not proposing you wouldn't propose expanding the elections to other levels of the court system, would you?
No. What I'm saying is the people who are currently who have to run in these contested elections, I think I would maintain that, and at the very least, I would make sure that even appointments that are made, whether it's for the courts or any other part of my potential administration, everything is accountable, everything is transparent, and even if I'm making appointments to lead my agencies to run these boards or courts, that the public does still have an input in that.
But if a judge's role is to do justice
Yeah.
and not to do popular justice, but to do justice,
Yeah.
and they're constrained by the ethics in in judicial canons and so forth, to not be able to be politicians the way you are or I was or what have you, then doesn't it make it a little, I don't know, awkward that a judge has to go out when they think they're doing the right thing, to have to go out and worry about what is the popular thing? And in addition, aren't you concerned about the raising of money on campaigns? Individuals who might be, who are lawyers who go before judges, have to go, not have to, but go to fundraisers and so forth. Doesn't that make that a little bit, isn't there a difference in your mind between somebody who actually represents the people versus somebody who's trying to represent justice?
I don't see it as different, because even it's all public service in my opinion. I'm running for governor because I'm trying to represent justice in my capacity. I'm trying to make sure we have more equitable policies, and we're making sure that we're making community members have trust and accountability with their elected officials, with their judges, with anything else. But that's where we can provide public financing, we can provide other resources. But the circuit court judges, for example, who are running for election, already, they usually run on a slate. They usually are able to at least share their records, defend their records in some ways already. So there's precedence.
So why not the district court then?
I mean, that's something we can look into. But it's using the systems we already have in place, number one, and then working to figure out what actually is the most practical next step. So yes, in theory, I think maybe we should open up elections as a whole, but I don't want to just make that statement right now, because that is something that I have not yet done enough in terms of how do I get from A to Z.
I mean, it's an interesting theory, and it's an interesting argument on both sides, but I guess in theory,
yeah.
Why would you elect the circuit court judges but not elect the district court judges? What's the jurisdictional difference between the two that would make you have one that's an election and one that's not?
For me, the only distinction right now is that we already have an election process in place with one, and we don't already have one in the other. That's pretty much the only reason why I don't want to make a blanket statement.
Okay. Court of Appeals judges?
I want to use whatever is existing in the structure. So whoever is already running for in a contested election, I want to maintain that. And then I want to look at either do we expand the electoral process, or are there other ways that we can make those appointments, at the very least, in the short term, more transparent and more accountable?
Okay. We've got about 5 minutes left. This hour flew by.
Yeah.
Definitely a bunch of different issues. Give me your 30-second, if you can, on immigration in a Jain administration, immigration issues that you want to cover.
Yeah, I mean, I helped organize to pass the Maryland Dream Act in 2010 to make sure that at least for children of immigrants, children of illegal, undocumented immigrants, still get access to in-state tuition, for example, still access to higher education. Part of my criminal justice platform is to remove the influence of ICE, especially for nonviolent offenders, and instead have it go through our Maryland agencies instead.
What does that mean?
So instead of essentially cooperating with federal ICE agents to turn in our folks, we make sure that any folks who are who are committing a crime that's nonviolent, we handle them through our justice system and not the federal justice system, or not through ICE.
So are you saying that if somebody is in our prison system,
Mm-hmm.
would you, and ICE says that they have a detainer on them, are you saying that you would ignore that ICE detainer for certain criminals, for certain individuals that are in our prison system? So somebody gets let's just say you have a drunk driving incident,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Which I don't know. I mean, I consider that a violent offense, but some people might not.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing under the law as a violent crime
Right.
and a non-violent crime, so it's just kind of what you think about it. But the if somebody was in our prison system on their 7th DUI, let's say, and ICE sent a detainer over and said that person is deportable, we're going to come get them, would you ignore that detainer, or would you cooperate with ICE on that?
I would make sure that we are handling it at the state level.
What is that? I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I don't understand what that means. So ICE wants to deport. Maryland's not deporting anybody. We either are or are not going to cooperate with the federal officials.
I would not cooperate with them.
You would not. You would ignore that.
I would ignore that. If there are, and again, I know you mentioned there's a distinction, but if they're nonviolent offenders, I would not cooperate with ICE, because again, I don't think ICE coming into our communities, even in our prison systems, is really making our communities actually safer, and we're not actually taking care of those residents who could still be active members of our communities.
Would you have a law that, because that was part of the original Trust Act, was a complete bar on cooperation with ICE.
Right.
Are you saying that you would favor that?
I would favor that, yes.
So in Prince George's County, a couple years ago, they did just that, and two MS-13 gang members who were in custody, and there was an ICE detainer on them. They ignored that ICE detainer. The gang members were released, and they went out and, within a very short order, hatcheted up a young girl who had been cooperative with the police in the first place. And so that led to a murder. In a case like that, where you have an individual that's a known gang member that's in there for, some potential, they haven't been convicted yet, but potential heinous crime, and ICE comes down with a detainer, are you saying that you would have a state law that followed what Prince George's County did?
Yes and no, right? That's why I make the distinction is for nonviolent offenders. We would not cooperate.
How would you determine who's a nonviolent?
Well, someone like, for example, an MS-13 gang member, right? They obviously have a history, or I would assume they had a history of some sort of violent crimes in the past, even if it wasn't in that particular instance. So we would look at their actual history, and then from there.
Who's we? The warden, or who is it that's going to make these arbitrary decisions?
Our justice system. So our Department of Correctional Facilities and Services, like our Maryland criminal justice system would make those determinations. And then if they determine that, yes, these people are violent offenders, then yes, we would cooperate with ICE. But again, that's why I started with, if they're non-violent offenders, right? That is one example which is horrendous and obviously would fall into the situations where we're cooperating with ICE. But for majority of the other folks that are not in that situation, I don't see the need to deport them.
Okay. So we have run out of time. Only about 2 minutes left, and lots to talk about. But first, let me just, before I wrap, say thank you so much for what has been a very quick hour of talking about some interesting policy. And members of the bar have sent in questions. A lot of them I couldn't get to, and they're very specific things about estates and trusts or corporate law, and I wouldn't even know if I was asking it correctly. But nonetheless, if it's okay with you, we'll send questions along and get them out to the different sections if we could. Yeah. I just want to say, Ashwani Jain, first-time candidate, 32 years old, looking to become the youngest governor, maybe in the history of the country. I'm not sure, but certainly
not the history.
I don't know where Bill Clinton was quite young, but thank you so much for spending this hour with us and the Maryland State Bar Association in coordination with Stevenson University. It's been a great time having you here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right.
Thank you.